All right, so we're going to start a new chapter here. This is chapter 18. And we're going to cover an area that we haven't really spent a lot of time in this course on so far, and that is Sub-Saharan Africa. So what we're going to do in this video is kind of look at some of the background context stuff that will take us up to where we are in time period 3. So this is all the stuff that was going on during time periods 1 and 2, and we didn't really cover this stuff in Sub-Saharan Africa. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that there's not a lot of written history, which means that we're kind of relying on archaeology and anthropology to gain some understanding. So there wasn't a lot of written history. In fact, most African history has an oral tradition in storytelling. So there's not a lot of written history of this time in Africa. So we have to get a lot of it from archaeology and anthropology and what we can get from the storytelling that's passed down through generations. The other reason that it's kind of difficult to talk about this period is because Africa is a really big and diverse place, which leads to lots of different cultures and societies, and they are all different and unique, which makes it very, very difficult to kind of make general statements about anything that's going on in Africa because every society is different. So these two facts make it kind of difficult to tell a narrative story in the same way that we've been telling narrative stories about the other big societies we've been looking at. That doesn't mean that this is any less interesting or important. It's just a much harder story to tell. So what we're going to do in this video is kind of tell as much of a generalized story as we can about this place. And then in the next video, once we've connected Sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the trade routes of Eurasia, we're going to start to be able to tell that narrative story that kind of fits the same pattern as what we've done in China or India or the Middle East. So, with all of that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about these societies. So, if we had to generalize, and again, it's difficult to do that, we're going to try to tell a story of the Bantu people and their effects. So, the Bantu people kind of serve as the kind of blueprint people. They are going to kind of spread throughout Africa and leave behind a lot of influences. So the Bantu are going to start, they kind of start in what is now Nigeria. And they're going to, from their starting point around where modern Nigeria is, and that is here, kind of in West Central Africa, kind of in here, and they're going to spread slowly throughout the rest of Africa. And as they spread, they're going to bring along with them the ideas of like iron metallurgy and pottery and domesticated animals, along with their language. So everywhere they go, they're going to bring with them these skills. We see a similar effect happen in Eurasia. So the Bantu are very similar to another group of people called the Indo-Europeans, who are basically going to do the same thing in Eurasia. So they start kind of in southern Russia and spread, as their name implies, to India and to Europe. And so they're going to kind of do this same thing in Eurasia that the Bantu people are going to do in Africa. And we can kind of trace their journey by seeing how much of their language is left behind as they went. So places that were very early in the Bantu migrations might have less language remaining from the Bantu, and the places that are more recent destinations for the Bantu, they may have more of the language left behind. But everywhere they go, they're going to bring this stuff with them. So what we're going to do here is kind of talk about Bantu societies. So, generally speaking, in a Bantu society, there was no private ownership of land. Now, this is very different than any of the societies we've looked at. And this is actually kind of similar to like a more nomadic society because you can't own the land. They're agricultural, but communal. You can't own the land, so everybody works together to farm. You can't own the land, but everybody has to eat. So we're all going to work together to do the farming. So because there's no private ownership of land, villages kind of shared the power. And villages were very small. Like maybe somewhere between 100 to 500 people. So villages shared power instead of having like rich landowners have the power. The people shared the power together to benefit everyone. That doesn't mean that there wasn't power in the villages. It just wasn't based on the ownership of land. So power was related to knowledge and skills. And like the history, knowledge and skills were passed orally, usually from fathers to sons. And this is where some power could be held, because if you had a special skill like metalworking or making leather or pottery, you held on to that skill. So this knowledge was kept secret. And that was a way that you could have power. Now, another thing that was a show of power or wealth was slavery. Slavery was pretty common in Sub-Saharan Africa. As it was one of the only ways to show wealth. So if you were wealthy, you couldn't buy land. That just wasn't something that you could do. But you could own slaves. Slaves were usually captured soldiers or people who were in debt, and they sold themselves into slavery to get out of debt. Now, in American history, the idea of slavery is one in which slaves are, very abused, they're mistreated. Slavery in Sub-Saharan Africa really wasn't the same as we have the idea of it in American history. Slaves were usually well treated and considered, more or less like employees or servants rather than like manual laborers. So they weren't free and you could order them around, but they weren't mistreated, they weren't abused like we kind of think of slaves in American history. And there was a trade in slaves. So we see African slaves as far away as the Abbasid Caliphate. Another part of Bantu society is that there was less patriarchy. Now, it's not exactly clear why there was less patriarchy. It may have to do with the nature of the agriculture, and that men and women were both needed. It may also have to do with kind of really ancient African societies like the Egyptians or the Nubians, who had female leaders. So it may be a combination of both of these things, that it wasn't weird to have women in leadership positions in Egypt or Nubia, and it probably also had to do with the idea that women were needed to do the farming. And so it's much more, it was much more common to see female leaders and there were more opportunities for women economically. One more kind of interesting idea about Bantu societies is how they organize the society into what are called age grades. Basically, an age grade is that all the children in the village work together doing certain tasks. So kind of think about it in terms of like elementary school age kids, middle school, and then high school age. And when you're a little kid, your job may be something like cleaning up. And when you get into being a little bit older, you might graduate to doing things like preparing meals. And then when you get into high school age, your job may become like taking care of the elderly. And what this does is that all the kids learn to work with each other so that when they become adults, they're ready to lead. They're ready to cooperate and work together, because they've been doing that their entire life. The last thing we'll talk about before we get into kind of bringing Africa into time period 3 is a little bit about African religion. So when we think about African religion, again, just like we said at the beginning of this, there are lots of different societies, there are lots of different cultures, and that also means there's lots of different religions. Generally speaking, most African religions honored a creator god of some sort. They also worshipped nature spirits, or sometimes nature itself. There was also quite a bit of ancestor veneration. Like what we might see in China or Japan. There was also a lot of religious thought and practice towards predicting or controlling the natural world or practical concerns like rainfall or good harvests. And in this way, we kind of see things that might be kind of like the Greek or Roman pantheon. Maybe not gods of things, but kind of in the same way that there's a Roman god of the sea or a Greek god of death. Kind of dealing with the natural world, that was a lot of what African religions tried to maybe not control but influence. There was a lot of emphasis on morality and proper behavior. And so in that sense, it kind of sounds a little bit like Christianity or Islam. And so it's not really that weird when we think about like the kingdom of Axum. Adopting Christianity in the early 4th century. So it really wasn't that weird that a sub-Saharan African kingdom might adopt a religion like Christianity, because a lot of African religion kind of overlapped with what Christianity was attempting to do. Maybe not in how Christianity does it, but in the end result, trying to like focus on proper behavior and morality. Okay, so we're going to stop there because pretty much at this point, we've now reached the beginning of time period 3. So this is kind of the foundation or the necessary background to understand what's going to happen to Africa in time period 3. So in the next video, we'll talk about how interactions with Eurasia is going to affect Africa, and now we can kind of look at Africa in the same kind of narrative or chronological structure that we've been looking at other societies. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.